Welcome to the DevReady Podcast. Joining me on today's episode of the DevReady Podcast, I have Michael Masterson. Thanks for joining me, Michael.
No, thanks for the opportunity, Anthony.
Well, I'll let you explain and introduce who you are, a bit of background about yourself. That way no one will have to subject to my voice going through this cold.
No worries. Hi, Michael Masterson. So look, I had a bit of an interesting accidental start. Myself and about 6 others accidentally started a company to a degree. And we ended up growing that to about 8,000 people over about 8 years. We ended up part of the Omnicom Group, which is a $40 billion company, New York Stock Exchange listed. And we grew that business from Melbourne, which is my hometown. And a lot of what I did in the business, pretty much did every job when you start off, with such a small team, was growing that business, from Melbourne throughout Australia and then up into Asia and now New Zealand, which I sort of fell in love with, I was going to say 20 years ago, but I think it might be even 30. And then ended up turning around 2 companies, one in freight and logistics, one in FMCG. And what was interesting about those businesses is that the financials told one story, the balance sheet, the P&L, the fixed asset register. Yet both businesses were pretty much about to run out of money. They completely disengaged their teams for different reasons. One was too nice, one was not so nice. And by going back to the fundamentals and really, the classic back to basics, understanding what the real assets were in the business, not that I could explain it anywhere near as well as we'll unpack shortly, we were able to turn those businesses around literally within, one was 6 weeks, the other one was 8 weeks, and both businesses, went on to thrive. And then I've done probably 30 scale-ups. I've done everything from marshmallow shooters, like literally guns that shoot mini marshmallows, to healthy vending machines. We launched the first promotional text-based messaging system in New Zealand. We launched one of the first completely drop-ship e-commerce companies in New Zealand. God, that's about 12 years ago. No staff, no stock. And that led me into this kind of world that I'm in now about 10, 12 years ago, where we started to help businesses understand where their value was. Second of all is how to de-risk those assets. Third is how to grow it. 4 is when there's a future capital event, you're raising money, exiting, IPO, M&A, joint venturing, etc. How do you explain the value? And then the last bit we help people with is how do you actually turn that into money going into your bank account? And so that's under Intrinsica. And, I'm incredibly lucky to be surrounded by, honestly, one of the most amazing groups of people. Everyone from probably the smartest guy in the world when it comes to IP, and that'll probably be one of the last times I use that term. And the former head of the spy agency, who also was the former CEO of the UK Intellectual Property Office. And then one of my other founders, has done 9 IPOs. Stephen Harrison, he launched Noble Oak, which some of you in Australia might know, large life insurance company. He was one of the founders of that 7 years ago, and they're currently 155 mil market cap. So I'm incredibly lucky to be surrounded by giants doing the work we do, and we're even luckier in that we get to work with some of the most incredible businesses, both everyone from literally people walking out of their back door into their garage, all the way up to some of the world's biggest companies, and then everything in between. So yeah, that's hopefully a very quick, high-level background.
Quite the journey you've been on, and it sounds like there's quite a pedigree of people that you're currently working with some of those checkboxes that you're ticking off on those resumes.
Yeah, look, the one thing I learned from literally doing that, that first, it was an accidental startup. None of us, I recently caught up with a very dear friend of mine who was the CFO in that business. Well, actually, that's probably a big title. He just dealt with the numbers. I dealt with anything with a plug to begin with. He dealt with anything with a dollar sign. We just weren't that organised. We didn't even know what those titles kind of meant. But the thing that taught me is that you can't build a business by yourself. That's delusional. You've got to build an incredible team around you, and you've got to be able to trust that team around you. Otherwise, eventually, as that business scales, the underlying trust will have pressure put on, and that company will collapse. And unfortunately, I've also had a few of those experiences as well, picking the wrong business partners.
Yeah, that can happen, and there's only so much you can do on your own. You can try and do 10 different things at the same time, but you'll do none of them well. It's always best to find out what you do well, focus on that, and then get the support to do the things you don't like doing.
Yeah, I think the other thing too, Anthony, is that I grew up incredibly working class in East Bentley, which back then was not East Bentley as today. I went to a pretty rough school, and then was very lucky to finish my last 2 years off at Brighton Grammar. And so it took me from like one world into a completely different world. One world, was, it was tough. It was a really tough environment. And then the other world, I had friends where their dads owned insurance companies, and literally they lived on acre sections in Brighton. But one of the things that I wish I could say that I knew this in my 20s, it's not the case. The older I get, the more I realize I don't know. And it's actually quite humbling every day to learn something every single day. Even yesterday, I learned a whole bunch of things, being around some other really incredible people doing things around ultimately helping people grow their business. And, people often say, what do you do? And we really help people work out not can they start a business, but should they start a business? But also, what's the potential scale of that business? Are they potentially putting everything, not just from a financial point of view, but from family and time and commitment? Because doing a startup, you've got to be insane. I mean, anyone who says, hey, I want to do a startup, I say, I'm so sorry, my condolences, because it's hell. Unless you're ridiculously lucky, and look, there's very few examples of that. You talk about the Zuckerbergs or Reid Hoffman. I mean, there was a lot of luck, and I've been a beneficiary of that luck. But people don't tell you the things that you probably should know before you start a business, like, the ability to be able to explain what you do, surround yourself with people that are not just smart. There's lots of smart people out there, but one of the big lessons I've learned is to surround yourself with people that have got battlefield experience, because there's a lot of what I call well-intended, but ultimately it's bad advice, because it's great theoretically, but it never survives that first step onto the battlefield. So being able to find those people in the ecosystem at a very, very early stage before you go and waste a whole bunch of time or capital is really, really important. And I think that's one of the things that I've been very lucky to find is, this group of people, not just, New Zealand, Australia, but at a global level. And, we work with our clients, which is good and bad, because I spend a lot of time living on a plane, helping them take that idea all the way through to an execution. Including a couple of our clients where we've literally, were there on the day they pretty much had the idea, and now they're going through to, some significant exits in the billions of dollars. And that's incredible. And I'd love to say we did it. We didn't. They did it. All we did was help guide them along the way. And it's great to see them achieve that sort of success.
And it's probably a really good experience to be able to see that growth from the idea inception all the way through to that exit, and probably having that company take on board the advice that you're providing, because I sort of relate that advice that you get as a business to when you're about to be a new father. I'm not sure if you're a father or not, but before you have children, everyone tells you 101 different things of this is what it's going to be like. But none of it means anything until you start going through the trenches with the baby and you're up in the middle of the night and you just have to deal with it on your own. So sometimes you have to make the mistakes yourself. You can't just learn from the others. But you have to be open to that advice to be able to move in the right direction and understand that, what you've got in mind is not the only way to be able to do something. And that's probably what you have to see or deal with a lot on a day-to-day, I'm guessing.
Yeah, and look, I suspect that you're part of this other club as well, apart from picking the wrong business partners. But the other club that I'm definitely a member of and have been for a long time is what I call the 3 a.m. club. Laying awake at 3 a.m. wondering how we're going to make payroll, how we're going to grow the business, how we're going to do this, and that's something, in fairness, that only an owner can go through. And one of my litmus tests is I will not take business advice from anyone that's not part of that 3 a.m. club, and I strongly recommend that to other people because, as you said, until you've actually been there on the battlefield and and had the virtual, literal bullets fly over your head, then no one can tell you what it's like to go to war. And a lot of people don't realize, they think starting a business, and look, starting a business is fantastic. If you come up with this, something that you're passionate about, a product or a service. But as I say to people, in particular when it comes to exporting, which is really that big jump, when you go from growing that business in your home market to now I'm going to jump on a plane, typically, and go and grow that product or service. As I say to people, it's not like going on holiday. It's like going to war. And it's not can you export, it's should you export. But even then, a lot of people might be able to work that out. But it's then where do you export? How do you export? And also when you export. And all of those things are really critical. And quite often we see people, for example, either not growing fast enough, which is probably, I would say, 80% of the people we come across. And sometimes the other 20% are growing too fast. In other words, they're trying to, it's a bit like Rommel, in World War II, now I'm showing my age. He was getting too far ahead of his supply lines. And
yeah, there's too many fronts you're fighting at once.
Yeah, and look, the classic 3 Cs, capital, capability, and capacity. It's like a 3-legged stool. You've got to keep the legs in balance. And, if you're going off and growing into, let's say, typically more than one market, I would say that for most Australian, New Zealand businesses, you're probably growing too fast. Now, having said that, obviously that first scale up we did, but we did that, initially in Australia. We focused on Australia. We grew that business in Australia. Then we went up to Asia, and then we came back down to New Zealand. So, and that was over an 8-year period. So I think what you've got to be constantly aware of, I sort of think about it like the magician who's got the 8 plates spinning on the stage. You've got to be watching all the plates and watching which one's going to wobble, and that's where your focus goes as a CEO or a founder.
Yeah, I think it definitely is a juggling act and spinning plates and multiple. It's on both arms at the same time sometimes, so you can't use one to balance the other. It's an interesting journey.
Your legs, your mouth, your nose.
Yeah, and your head. It's an interesting journey, not just business versus if you want to be a tech startup, because that's what probably most people see when they think entrepreneur and they see the big exits on the unicorns and all that sort of stuff. But they don't understand the amount of work that goes into it. Everyone thinks there's an overnight success, but they never see the 10, 15 years before as it happens.
Well, look, one of the examples I'll give you, because I'm big on examples. And look, if you ever want to work out someone's battlefield experience, always ask them for their case studies. Ask them, like, give me an example of what you did. Where did you start? What did you do? What was the outcome? And, I've got a couple of favorites. One is a company called Agros. And most people have never heard of Agros in Australia. And when we met John and Hari, one of the first things they told us is they'd failed for 35 years. They'd blown through tens of millions of dollars. And what they'd worked out was how not to do what they were trying to do. And what they were trying to do was extract plasma from blood at they ended up working out how to extract plasma from blood at half of the cost of the incumbent providers. Now that is a massive competitive advantage, whatever you want to call it. But second of all, is that market is dominated by a particular company called CSL. Now CSL most days of the week is the largest company on the ASX. So what they told me in that one statement is that they'd come up with something really special, but second of all, they had a massive opportunity from a capital perspective in terms of being able to generate revenue. And the thing we're always looking for to begin with is what's your ability to generate a better margin to be able to convert that into a market share, because ultimately that's going to give an investor better return on capital. Because capital will chase growth. Your ability to scale that business will mean that you're able to provide the funding that's going to support that business growth. And look, John and Hari had got some conflicted advice, and we often find that. We often find the other thing is that people giving the advice benefit from that advice. E.g., you go to I'll pick on accountants for a second, and you say to an accountant, hey, look, how do I grow my business? They'll tell you it's all about the accounting, get the accounts sorted out, blah, blah. You go to a lawyer, you'll get the same thing. A patent attorney will probably tell you to file a patent. And that's because of what they do. And so what you want to look for is someone who is unencumbered from that advice. And so the first thing we identified is that they had the wrong capital strategy. They were heading for an IPO. And guess what? The people giving them that advice were the people who did IPOs. So they were inherently conflicted. Now, it was as clear as day to us that A, they were out of cycle for IPOs, but second of all, they were completely non-ready. They were a pre-revenue company in biotech. It was literally, they literally didn't get one tick in any of the boxes. Eventually, after I think it was about 3 or 4 months, there was some things that happened with their incumbent provider where John then took our advice, and we went through exactly what we normally start with, which is let's work out what the real assets are of this business. If we know it's not the financial statements, the balance sheet, the P&L, the fixed asset register, where is the value in Agros? And Agros had come up with some incredible, what we refer to as intrinsic assets. And in their case, they had incredible systems and processes, knowledge and know-how. They were looking to patent what they were doing. Now, unfortunately, with what they were going to patent, it was the wrong tool in the toolbox to use. Sometimes patents, albeit very rarely, can be very, very relevant to a business. But for what they were trying to do, it was the wrong tool. In their case, we needed to keep it as a trade secret, which was their manufacturing process. We got them to change that. And that was part of the second element we were dealing with, which is the risks. What are the risks around those assets? And the thing with intrinsic assets, which, by the way, represent typically 99% of where the value is in every business. You think about your own business. No one would ever buy or invest in you for that microphone or that set of headphones or your desks, your chairs, your computers. They're going to invest in you because of your brand, your networks, your relationships, your knowledge, your know-how. There's 10 clear buckets that we've created. And that was exactly where the value was in Agros. So they were able to then raise a small amount of private capital that enabled them to get through some of the barriers they were going to get through. And some of those barriers included, for example, dislodging CSL from being a sole collector of blood in Australia, for example, for plasma. That was a big barrier, but also getting things like their TGA approvals, regulatory approvals are an incredibly valuable intrinsic asset. And as they went through, we were able to do the fourth thing we do, which is work out what they were worth at that moment in time. But most importantly, we trained them and worked with them to be able to explain that value to investors. So first capital raise was around 38 million valuation, pre-revenue. In fact, the first one was about 8 million, then about 38 million. About 18 months later was around 88 million, still pre-revenue. By the way, all oversubscribed. Wow. Then the AFR did a fantastic article in October 22. I recommend anyone to go and read it because it explains way better than I'll be able to do on this podcast where the value was in Agros, and more importantly, why you didn't want to invest, but almost like you had to invest in Agros. And by pure luck, I happened to be at Agros's offices in Macquarie Park in Sydney the next day. And the phone was literally ringing off the hook. And I said to John Harry, wow, your phone's going nuts. And they said, yeah, it's investors wanting to invest into us. And then about 18 months ago, we valued them at over $1 billion pre-revenue. And they were oversubscribed last August. And now they're in the process of heading for a very large IPO, which Macquarie Capital's leading. And we expect that could be in the billions of dollars. So that's an example of, two people who had failed and, for a variety of reasons, getting the right advice at the right time, being part of that ecosystem because it wasn't just us, we brought in a number of other people around them, and then taking them through to those execution events. But don't get me wrong, as I said at the start, John and Hari did the work. All we did was help them work out where they might go wrong and keep them on track. But most importantly, help them to explain where the value was in that business, because no one will invest in you or acquire you or even probably work with you unless they understand that value.
Yeah, and it's the value that they're going to get the benefit from. So it's not the asset as an accountant would see. As you said, it's the intrinsic things. It's the things that you don't normally put a price on, which is why that word's used, I'm guessing, in how you define it. So how would a business go about trying to define what their value is and what the intrinsic assets are without giving away too much of what you do or a free session to all the listeners?
That's okay. Look, we're really open about this because it's a bit like me trying to do plumbing. I can understand the theory of plumbing, but as my plumber will tell you, he loves when I mess around with plumbing because I normally make it much worse and he gets to send me a much bigger invoice. And I think it's one of those things that the first thing I would say to anyone is just the first thing you've got to work out is what makes you special. Now, that's not special in terms of a customer wanting to buy your product, but also what makes you special from an investor. And there's four sort of key questions that we often find companies can't explain, especially when they're raising capital. And the first question, when you look at an IM, for example, and IMs can range from, if it's really good, maybe 9 pages, maybe even less, and the really bad ones are up into literally 100 pages. And I can't tell you how many, probably thousands of IMs I've read or investor documents where it takes me pages and pages and pages to try and work out what they do. So the first thing is just explain what you do in one sentence. The second thing is, who are your customers? In other words, why are people going to buy from you? What makes you special? The third question, which is very rarely covered, or it's so obtuse in the document you often can't find it, is how am I as an investor going to make my money back? In other words, why should I give my money to you as opposed to the plethora of other companies out there that are all wanting my capital? But the last question I've almost never seen in a document, or if it is, again, you really need a multitude of degrees to be able to work it out. And that is, how are you going to stop people copying what you do and eroding the market share that you might initially gain? In other words, how are you going to win the race? And ideally, if I'm being honest, become a monopoly. Because if you've got really amazing intrinsic assets, and there's what we would define as strong, then when you think about it, if they're really strong intrinsic assets, I can't replicate what you do. But if they're weak intrinsic assets, then I can replicate what you do, and I can probably innovate over the top of you. And that's why, for example, I don't think any of us are on MySpace anymore, apart from me and Justin Timberlake. MySpace started off way before, Instagram and all the other social media platforms, but they didn't survive. And you saw people like Instagram and Facebook essentially roll over the top of them. That's why you and I are probably not using Netscape right now. Now I'm really showing my age, because it's one thing to be, and that's where first mover is a complete misnomer. There are almost no examples of first mover going out and building market, holding on to market, keeping market, and then generating the most amount of capital from that market. It's very, very rare. So coming back to the question,
That's okay.
The first thing I would do is just work out, what are those assets that make you special? In other words, identify those assets. The first thing we do with a client, we'll go into a client and work out, okay, you're generating a better margin and/or better market share, hopefully, because that's a good problem to have. How and why are you doing it? And what are the assets that are enabling you to do that? So think about Apple. Why do people buy Apple products? It's because it's an Apple product. It's their brand is now their biggest asset. But the day that Jobs, Wozniak, and by the way, the third guy, was 3 founders of Apple, started it, their brand was worth zero. In fact, their original logo is one of the most horrible logos you can ever see. If you want to see
terrible,
the worst logo,
the Isaac Newton with the apple and the tree.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But it's horrible. It's all hand-drawn and it's really ugly. But what you find is, as they then release their products or services, what the products and services do is they kind of ratchet up the brand over time. And so what you find is that your brand, 2 ways I like looking at a brand. It's either the inverted umbrella that's capturing the other 9 intrinsic assets as they build value, or it's the scoreboard for the 9 intrinsic asset players on the field, playing for your product or service. It's the reflective value, and it builds up over time. And the other good thing with brands is they build momentum. So as we know, when Jobs left, Apple made some pretty bad decisions. It was the Apple Newton was probably a good example. And their value started to go down, but their brand carried them through, so that when Jobs came back, he was able to accelerate out of that corner. So work out what your assets are. Then you'll be able to work out some of the risks. In other words, think about what the asset is. And for example, let's say you've got a trade secret or a manufacturing process. Well, you've got to keep that as a trade secret, almost certainly. You don't patent that, for example. I was with someone yesterday who said, look, we want to become global. And in the first 3 minutes, I identified they didn't own their brand. They were going to go and build this brand globally, yet they didn't own it. And an example of this is Afterpay. I remember sitting and hearing Anthony Eisen, who's a lovely guy. Anthony, if you listen to the podcast, definitely one of the nicest people I've met. But he was giving a briefing, which I was part of, and talking about how they were going to expand into the UK. And within 3 minutes, I messaged back to one of the team in the office and said, hey, do they own their brand? No, they don't own their brand in the UK. So I said to Anthony, hey, look, I know something you don't. Would you like my help? And he said, look, Michael, we've got lawyers, accountants, patent attorneys. We don't need another advisor. So, okay, look, I know something they don't, but sure. Anyway, a couple of weeks later, I emailed him, Anthony, you sure you don't want my help? No, we're all good. He was lovely about it, really nice. But what I knew that he didn't is that they hadn't registered that trademark in the UK. Now, what I probably should have done is I should have gone and registered it. I didn't.
Yep.
But someone else did. And that's why they're not called Afterpay in the UK, they're called ClearPay. Now, that was completely preventable. So if a company like Afterpay can get this wrong, then all I would say is if you're literally walking out of your back door into your garage, your odds are not great. Mm-hmm. But then the third thing is think about how you're going to scale that company exponentially. You know, organic growth is great, but that's going to make you essentially a cottage industry. You've got to be thinking about how do I scale rapidly? And so that's where I'd start. Just start with those three. If you've done that, honestly, you are on your way to success. But the other thing I would strongly say to you is if you think good advice is expensive, wait until you pay for no advice or bad advice. And I've certainly done that. You know, I am that plumbing example of trying to fix my plumbing. And then my plumber comes along and says, look, if I'd come here before you did it, it would have been $100, but it's now looking like $500 because, you've inadvertently made things worse.
Yeah, there's an opportunity cost there where you think, all right, I can do what I need to do because I roughly understand what that means. And then you go and attempt it, which is your plumbing example or anything I do around the house. But yeah, unless you're working in that space or you know the ins and outs, you don't know all the little nuance and detail that is actually necessary to make that a successful step, which is where that comes in. And that cost of a mistake can sometimes kill your company too, not necessarily just be expensive.
Absolutely. And look, there's nothing sadder than someone who comes up with truly something amazing and we never see that get to the marketplace. And we see this a lot around medical devices and biotech, for example, where you see people literally coming up with stuff that is truly game-changing, and then they run out of capital. And the saddest part is that never gets to patients. It's never there to help people. And let's be honest, we all typically come up with an idea because we want to make the world a better place. Sometimes it's for other reasons, but most people I find are genuinely doing something because they're passionate about it and they just want to make a difference. They want to leave a legacy. So there's nothing sadder than getting that wrong advice at the wrong time and you blow up on the battlefield. And that's really, really sad. And look, unfortunately, history is littered with such things. Tesla was probably a good example, as in Tesla, the person. A lot of his inventions have unfortunately, never become commercial successes.
It's only because of Elon Musk that people know the name. Or most people know the name Tesla anyway.
Yeah. So, and that's one of the reasons they called it Tesla, is because Musk could see the genius.
Homage to him.
And look, as I say to people, unfortunately, the idea is 1%. People go, what do you mean? Like, it's all about the idea. I go, no, it's not. We all have ideas every 5 minutes. Taking that idea through to execution, where someone pays you money, that's probably the next 5 or 10%. That's great. So someone wants your product. But scaling that business and scaling to where you are the dominant global player, that is really hard. And I can assure you, to go and create an AGROS is not easy. We also worked with AirTrunk, who you might know of. They're getting a lot of press at the moment. When I first spoke to Robin Kurter, I think it was about 8-9 years ago, no one would help Robin. He was really struggling. No one could help him explain where the value was in AirTrunk. He went to the traditional big four and, they were basically, you're uninvestable. You don't have a business. Go get a job. And, I was able to help Robin not just identify what made him special, which he knew in his gut, but most importantly, find a way to protect that. And that, again, was by a trade secret. But the fourth element that we really helped Robin with was explain the value. And that's where Grant Samuels, in that case, with Goldman Sachs, were able to take our valuation to the investors, where the investors gave Robin that initial funding. And, now AirTrunk, fast forward, is now in the process of doing, a $16 billion plus exit. But that all started with a phone call from Robin and I talking about, again, those basic building blocks. What were the assets? What were the risks? How was he going to grow that business? How was he going to become a dominant player? Which, data centers are highly competitive. But most importantly, being able to explain that value to an investor to give him the capital to enable him to grow. But ultimately, that's why, 3 years after that, Macquarie buys 78% for $3 billion. They wouldn't have paid that unless they could see that future value. And that future net value is now being realized in, a $16 billion plus exit. But it all started with that phone call between Robin and I.
Yeah, and the investor needs to understand, probably the value is the most important thing, but it's also like the why. It's why are we going after this person? Why would we go in? Because it's just seeing numbers saying, oh, you'll get a 10x return or a 50x or whatever the number is, isn't going to get them excited as knowing that the person they're going into, buying into that journey and knowing that that person can actually take them to where they need to go. And it's open to ideas and understanding and pivoting in the right way.
Yeah, and look, in Robin's one he was one of the senior executives of NextDC. So he had that track record, he had that street cred. Now, again, from an accounting perspective, how do you explain street cred? How do you explain experience and knowledge and know-how? And also to what we call negative know-how. So negative know-how is where you know all the ways how not to do something. Yep. And that's often why you hire a plumber, because the plumber knows how not to fix the tap in all the wrong ways. Therefore, they've come to the conclusion of how to do it correctly. And, the reason, you get engaged by clients and we get engaged ultimately is because we know how not to do it, which has led us to finding a better way to be able to do it. And so that's where I come back to. It's finding the right person, but then asking the right question. And look, we often find that in particular, scaling companies will often ask the wrong questions. And I'll give you an example. Going to, and I don't mean to pick on any of the service industries, look, we all have our faults. But going to a patent attorney, for example, and saying, can I get a patent? Now, that's a technical question, and most of the time you can get a patent for most things. Getting patents is not hard, believe it or not. The right question is, should I get a patent? So now you're going from a technical question to a commercial question. And a good patent attorney at that point will say, actually, I'm not the right person to tell you that. You need commercial advice. And that's kind of where we sit, is working out not whether you can, but actually whether you should. And then if it's a should, is a patent the right tool in the toolbox? Because as I said, there's a number of tools on how to work with those assets. And unfortunately, patents, for the most part, is not the answer. Idea doesn't equal patent.
No, patent normally is there. I'll say, patent is there normally as just like a checkbox for an investor to say, all right, there's some protection of something for a certain level of investors.
Yeah, and look, you've hit on a really good point, Anthony, which is it's not just the founders or even the boards that are sometimes asking the wrong questions. It's also investors. So investors saying, do you have a patent, is the wrong question. The right question is, how are you going to stop other people replicating what you do? And then hearing what the answer is, hearing what the strategy is. It's not about the tool, it's about what's the strategy. And for example, in AirTrunk's case, I spent quite a bit of time with Robin helping him explain why patent wasn't the right answer. We knew that he was going to get asked that question a lot by especially the early stage investors. Now, he was dealing mostly with high net worths and family offices, so they weren't so bad. But yeah, that was a question that he got asked a lot. So we worked on that narrative about taking the investor through and explaining to them the strategy as to why we weren't going to patent, why we were going down a trade secret strategy. But the other thing too is it's okay to talk about the what, but you never talk about the how. So again, in both Agros and AirTrunk, I'm just using those as two examples because they were two founders that have gone through to massive scale. To their credit, they both did it. But most importantly, how they did it was something they never talked about. We talked about what they did, not how.
Yep. Which I can probably see a not a parallel, but the opposite of that with all the new startups that have been coming up in the tech space for the past 18, 24 months that are LLMs, generative AI, and then they're building on top of them, which is something that we're doing as well. But I'm not sure how much you've been in that space or how many conversations you have about startups or people in that area, but then how do you sort of protect yourself in that space where there's this commoditized asset now that everyone's using, the generative AI, rather than having to go through and build your own models, but then you've got some spin or something that at times there's been a lot of startups that have just been wiped away with a new OpenAI update, which
Absolutely.
maybe they didn't have enough value to begin with.
And that's what I was going to say to you. Look, to me, it's like, what I suppose people went through in the Industrial Revolution, and you had the Luddites saying this is the end of humanity, and, don't go down the path. Look, AI is just the next iteration in human evolution. And look, for some people, it'll be an enhancer, and other people, unfortunately, it will probably be the end of their product or service. But this is why I come back to those sort of 4 questions is, again, what do you do? Who are your customers? How am I going to make a return? But ultimately, how are you going to stop or slow down competitors? And all I would say to you is that if your answer, to what's going to stop everyone and I'm special is regenerative AI, well, that's a commoditized product. That's like saying I'm going to use the internet, or I'm going to use electricity. You've got to really be thinking about coming back to those 10 intrinsic assets. What are the intrinsic assets? But not just what are they, but how are they going to work together? Because intrinsic assets, it's very rare that you'll have 10 intrinsic assets that are amazingly strong. It's not like you're starting off with a brand like Apple, or you've got regulatory approvals like you would for a drug discovery. Knowledge and know-how take typically a long time to build up. So especially early stage companies, will start off with maybe 1 or 2 reasonably strong intrinsic assets, and you've got to build the others up over time, but they then work together, and that's how you form them into fists. And as we know with fists, having them is one thing, knowing how to use them is another. And, for those that have ever done boxing training, the first thing that you get taught is not to attack with your fists. It's not about growing. It's about how are you going to defend? How are you going to hold the territory that you take before you go and try and take more, e.g. growth? And so often we find, as I said earlier, people are trying to typically grow too fast in the wrong area without actually hanging on to what they've already worked really hard to hang on to. And again, most companies have made this mistake where they've inadvertently given away things because they didn't know how to protect them properly. Microsoft, for example, in the 80s was famous, or Bill Gates was famous saying, I don't believe in patents, they're irrelevant. Which was not the right thing to say, and because patents, in particular if you're Microsoft at that scale, you need them to be able to cross-license with other people that are attacking you with their patents. Now that's Microsoft. Yeah. But the day Microsoft started, it was probably not that relevant. For most software tech businesses, often the patent's not the answer. What they do, it's typically kept as trade secret. There'll be a particular piece of code that you might want to hide. You don't want everyone having access to that code. You might not want them to know exactly what that code does, how it interacts with the rest of the code base. So depending on even what your business is, there are different ways to protect different assets within each of those. And again, AI is the buzzword that everyone's using. A lot of people still really are talking about things like machine learning, as I'm sure you'd be well aware of. But it's a buzz term, a bit like as we talk about investors. Investors often don't know the right questions to ask, and they kind of go, do you have a patent? Do you have a brand? Is it AI driven? They're kind of catching on often the buzzwords, in particular at the angel and the early seed stage investors. I'm hoping by the time you get into a VC and institutional investors, they're a little bit more aware that they're the wrong questions to ask. You really want to ask more open-ended questions like how are you going to stop your competitors? And really what you're wanting to hear there is not just what the assets are, but how the assets going to work together. In other words, what's your intrinsic asset strategy? And that's what we spend a lot of time helping those companies explain what that strategy is without giving away the secret sauce as part of the process.
Okay. So just before we probably wrap up, you mentioned that the brand is one of the 10 value items. Do you care to share what the other 9 are, just at a very top level, just so everyone gets an idea of what things they should be looking at? Look, and then if they come to you, they've got some frame of reference?
Yeah, look, and what I was going to say to you is that you don't have to be as prescriptive as we are around what this is. Even if you just start with, hey, what makes me special? And you just sit down and you start to, it's like, I'm sure everyone's had their mum at some point say, look, Anthony, you're special because of, and it's the same thing. But look, the 10 categories, and these are in no particular order, is brand, and brand is not your logo, by the way. It's how people see your business, and that's why it takes a long time. Trade secrets. So can you keep something secret from other people being able to replicate? And here, one of the examples we use is Google. I don't know how Google's search algorithm works. In fact, it's constantly changing and evolving. Inventions, which is typically where we put patents. So in other words, what am I going to come up with something that is genuinely unique? So it's not innovation. Sometimes you can innovate, but it's typically where you're inventing something brand new. Fourth is software, which is obviously an area you know very, very well. Fifth is know-how. So in other words, how do I know how to write code in a way that, for example, someone else doesn't? As you're also well aware, data can end up becoming an incredibly valuable asset, but data, for and of the most part, is akin to dirt. Now, why is it akin to dirt, not gold, as some people say? And that's because you've got to find a use case for data. In other words, you've got to find a way to monetize it. And when you think about dirt, what do you do with dirt? You either grow something in it, you pull something out of it, or you build something on top of it. But the dirt's not the valuable bit. It's what you're doing with it. And data's exactly akin to dirt in that regard.
Okay, I like that.
Seven's relationships. So imagine you're an early stage software company and for whatever reason, Bill Gates is a family friend. You've now got access to be able to do something with that. Now, you've still got to have something that's good, but you've got the ability to get to someone who's pretty important. Number 8 is design. So in other words, how do I think Apple is probably the exemplar of this. You can see someone's phone from 50 meters away and go, that's an Apple phone. It's an iPhone. Or, that's an Apple product because of the look and feel. I think Tesla's done a very good job of this. You can normally pick a Tesla, at a distance. 9 is content. Netflix, I think, is a great example. Why do most of us have Netflix? Is because they've got better content than everyone else. In fact, you normally have Netflix and then you'll have a secondary provider. It's pretty rare that you'll have, say, Disney, but not Netflix. And then number 10, as I mentioned earlier, in particular for some of our clients, is regulatory approvals. And say, for example, if you're a medical device or a pharmaceutical, that's not a nice to have, that's a have to have. In other words, if you don't have it, you can't actually sell your product or service.
Yep.
So they're the 10 intrinsic asset classes. It's a brand, trade secrets, invention, software, know-how, data, relationships, design, content, regulatory. So just start to break your business down. The same way, when you think about it, you take your box of receipts and you give that to your accountant, and your accountant turns that into a balance sheet, a P&L, and a fixed asset register. That's all they're doing. We're saying start the same process with those intrinsic assets, the things that you can't kick with your toe, is break them down into those 10 categories. That's the first thing that I would do.
Okay. It's a great starting point, at least a point of reflection for most businesses and startups or anyone out there to go, all right, how many of these 10 items do we have? How can we classify them? And then start working on improving or implementing things to get into something covering each of those items. And then probably something to keep in mind is the brand. It's not an overnight thing. That's probably the one that takes the most time to get right and have that right reputation in the market to actually have people see you the right way.
Yeah, and that's the thing, is a brand is not what you think you are. It's how people see you. Think about Apple. It's how we all see Apple. Whether you love them, hate them, doesn't matter. You've got to admit, they've done an incredible job. People are devout to the brand. Some people, it's like McDonald's with the Happy Meals. That's why they do Happy Meals, is to get you hooked on the brand early. And Apple are fantastic at doing that. And that's why most, once you're in that Apple ecosystem, it's not like you'll have 10 Apple products and then one Android, because the Android just doesn't work quite the same way. And I think Apple have done that better than anyone else, is creating that ecosystem. That customer journey.
Definitely. Samsung's far behind, but they've got a similar thing. Once you're with Samsung, you stick to Samsung almost.
Yeah,
but Apple's been leading. Yeah.
Yeah, it's the whole,
the tech
Apple
factions.
Windows debate.
But
look, there's always got to be two, typically.
Yeah, and Apple's been doing that since the days of the iPod, when they first released that music player, and then that's really when they cornered the market on that thing, cannibalized that to the next product, and then grew around it.
Absolutely. And this thing, it takes a long time to become an overnight success.
Yep.
Very rarely does someone launch a business and instantaneously they're the global leader in what they do and everyone knows them. It takes a long time. And look, a lot of people get things wrong. Think about Kodak. Kodak used to be synonymous with photography.
Yep.
Now, if you probably said that to someone in their late teens, they'd go, who?
Yeah, they wouldn't have a clue.
You and I know Kodak, but I suspect my kids probably don't know who Kodak is. Fax machines. You and I probably still remember what a fax machine is. I said to someone the other day, "Oh, yeah, we used to fax things," and they looked at me and went, "What's a fax?" So often brands are generational too. But again, brands you've got to keep. That's why every year Apple are releasing new products. There's not a new iPhone every 4 or 5 years because their brand won't sustain that. Apple have worked out, as have Samsung and everyone else, every year you've got to be bringing out a new product. But that started with Nokia and Ericsson. Nokia and Ericsson did that too. But, people like Samsung and Apple, who, by the way, never used to make phones, for some of you on the call, there was no Apple or Samsung product when the first phones came out. But the people who created the phone industry, which essentially Nokia and Ericsson and Motorola, pretty much don't exist now. I mean, Nokia has a minor part. Ericsson's completely out of phones. Although they sold to Sony, and Motorola is barely there as well.
Yeah, it's interesting that those brands can be as large as they can be, but then if they don't keep up and keep that brand value going, then you forget about them or they lose market share and then they have to stop doing that entire business. That's brand's very important.
Absolutely, and BlackBerry. BlackBerry saw Apple coming and ignored them at their peril. Nokia ignored Apple as well. And so that's the thing is that, even though you could argue they were kind of first movers, they're not the dominant players today. And so, the famous story, of course, is Blockbuster saying no to Netflix. Probably one of the greatest corporate screw-ups in history. But that's where hindsight's great. And that's why, typically the people who know the stuff that you don't, more often than not will have some grey hair. And that's because they've made those mistakes. The reason that you'll go and engage, let's say, a top lawyer who's normally in their 50s or 60s, more than you would pay someone who's just come and finished their law degree, is because that person in their 50s, 60s has got 30 years of experience understanding what the law says, but also what the law does. And that's what you're paying for. You're paying for the things they've learned outside of law school. And so again, the best advice I can give anyone is please only take advice from people who have been on the battlefield. The example I use is that, if you're talking to someone about exporting, here's a little trick I've learned. Ask them what their frequent flyer status is. At which point the person will, why are you asking me that? And in my humble experience, I would only take advice from people around exporting that are Platinum 1 or Gold Elite, which I'm both. Because you've got to spend your time on the seat doing it. And then the other question I often have is, well, they're giving me advice about growing my business, let's say. Have they grown their own business? So let's say, for example, that Intrinsika was only based in one market. Then I wouldn't be taking commercialization or growth advice from us. We're in multiple markets. That's because we're practicing what we preach. And I think that's really important, is that a lot of people give advice, but they're not able to demonstrate how it's actually being used in their own business.
Yep. Those armchair commentators, as they call them.
Things I wish I knew this stuff when I was in my early 20s. I wouldn't have made a lot of the mistakes that I have, and I'd be an incredibly wealthy person.
But you also might not have listened to yourself either, as some people don't.
I absolutely wouldn't have.
Yeah.
But that's also why I loved working with the people that we do who are in their 20s, because that enthusiasm, that rawness, but being able to take those raw ideas that are brilliant because they've thought of something that no one else has, because we've built up all of our negative knowledge, and we've probably thought about all the ways how not to do it. They naturally come up with a way to do it, but then you've got to match that intrigue and that intellect, and sometimes, I'll be honest, that naivety, which is wonderful, with that experience from the battlefield. And my daughters, were just so creative and clever until they got to about 8 or 9, and then you could see the school system kind of pulling them back. And that's why, most true founders, I'll use Musk. I mean, he's crazy. I mean, he's batshit crazy.
Yeah,
I mean, who would have ever
wants.
gone and started up, not just Tesla, but then when Tesla was almost about to run out of money and failing, his history is well known, he then goes and starts up SpaceX. Like, no one in their right mind would have said that was a smart idea. But he's now dominating multitudes of market. He's now not just got, the world's most valuable car brand, or close with BYD, depending on which day. SpaceX is like, the brand to know about. Now, I would argue Rocket Lab is probably the better business, but to Elon's credit, everyone knows who SpaceX is, whereas outside of typically New Zealand and Australia, no one knows who Rocket Lab is. Yet Rocket Lab, I think, is a better investment. They've got some better intrinsic assets than what SpaceX does. But you've got to be kind of crazy to be a founder, and I say that as a founder. But as you get older, you probably become less of a founder, in particular if you haven't had those early stage successes. It's bloody hard. I mean, being an inventor, crossing across the inventor space, it's tough. A bit like a gambler. Everyone talks about their successes, but not their failures.
Yeah, and ideas can come from anywhere, and I have thousands of them, but like you said, the idea is, everyone thinks it's all about the idea, but the idea is just the seed. That doesn't get you anywhere.
Yeah, ideas are easy. Yep. Commercialization, that is really hard. Yep. And when people
Especially
say to me, I'm an expert in commercialization, I'll be honest, like, I kind of go, really? Like, give me some examples. And it worries me that when someone makes that statement, they often can't give me an example. And I do worry when people will then, and look, I've had this a couple of times, people say, oh, well, I'm ex-Google. Oh, but your name's not Larry or Sergey. When did you join Google? Oh, I was there for the last 5 years. Well, I'm pretty sure Google started back in the 90s. And that's the thing, is just because you worked at a company that's done that doesn't mean that you can do it. And we often see in particular boards, that have misaligned skills on the board. And it's not to say that these people are bad. They're great. But being a great lawyer or an accountant is awesome. That doesn't make you someone who can help scale a business. Unless you're Brett Kelly from Kelly Partners, who I've worked with. Kelly Partners they're an accounting firm. But, when we started working with Brett, the share price was around 80 cents. It's now, I think last time we looked, about $8.70. But they're still an accounting firm. But what Brett's able to do is understand what his intrinsic assets are, but then how he used them to grow them. But I think probably the most important thing we helped Brett with was the ability to explain that value. Now, Brett I'd put onto a board any day of the week because he's been there, done that on the battlefield. Now, he's an accountant, but he's done what he said he could do. I look at, say, Kane Lawyers. Kane have gone from being an Adelaide law firm to now where they're in Sydney, they're in Melbourne. They're growing. They're doing what they say they can do. These are examples of people where you're hiring them not for their technical expertise, but their business expertise. But for the most part, they're probably not aligned for the people you want on your board. You want people that have been on the battlefield, that have scaled businesses, that are aligned with your industry. E.g., if you're a tech company, someone who's done it in biotech is probably not that helpful, I would suspect. And what you want is a diversity of thinking and skills at board, for example. And that's what you want to surround yourself. You don't want to hire people or have people around you that know the things you do. You want them to know the things you don't. Yep.
You need help in areas that you don't know. And you don't want to just hire people to leverage the brand cache of a resume, which is what most of those people, former X, former Y, you see it on LinkedIn all the time. So if anyone wants to reach out... sorry, Michael, I'm just conscious of the time.
The last thing I was just going to say is when, and to your exact point, don't look at where people have worked. Ask them what they've done. And so,
that's a much better way
process, their brand, no. What did you do? Give me an example. You went in and A was happening, and what did you do, B, C, and what was the outcome, hopefully G, H, and I?
Yep. Yeah, because you could be an ex-Google and you could have worked in the free kitchen they give, where they create food for employees. Doesn't help you with anything, really. Yep. So it's always, what have you done? How are you actually, where can you provide your value and your perspective from? Yeah, I think I'm going to take that away.
Absolutely.
So if anyone wants to reach out to you and find out more about what you do at Intrinsica and get in contact, how can they do that?
Oh, look, either website, you can get hold of us there. It needs a serious refresh. We're working on that at the moment. But LinkedIn's probably, it's my favorite tool. One of the best bits of advice I got, probably 30 years ago when LinkedIn was just coming out, was to get on LinkedIn. And I've been on there for a long time, and it's a fantastic way to connect to people that you normally can't get to. So now there are two other Michael Mastersons on LinkedIn. I should forewarn you. One of them is a multi-millionaire book author. That's not me. And the other one is Scottish. That's also not me. Apparently he's pretty successful too. So either find my one, which is under Australia. I think I'm the only one in Australia. So yeah, but look, and what we do with anyone is we're happy to sit down with an hour and see whether we can help. And look, the good news is we'll give you kind of that bullshit-free shower. And that's because we're not charging you for that hour. We're trying to tell you not just whether you can, but whether you should. But most importantly, are we the right people to help you? Because the good news is if it's not us, we nearly always know the right people to help you. So the people I was dealing with yesterday who didn't own their brand, within 24 hours, we've put them onto an amazing trademark attorney who's helped them sort out their brand. It's done. Like, it's sorted. It's something they now don't have to worry about. But what they were doing was building their pyramid on quicksand. And that really worried me. And that's why I said to them, you need to do this today. But because I said it, and I don't benefit from that advice, they went and did it. So look, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn. Happy to have a chat to see whether we or someone that we know can help. And yeah, you can join the club of the rest of the crazies who start a business like you and I, Anthony.
Yep. Well, it's been a pleasure, Michael. We'll add all those links into the show notes, and everyone will get that. So once again, thank you for joining me. It's been a pleasure. I'm sure we could have done another hour or two, but conscious of time, we did have to cut that there. So apologies for that. But yeah, thank you once again.
No, thanks for the opportunity, and great that we finally made this happen. For those of you who don't know, this is probably our 20th go at trying to get this.
Probably it's been quite a few calendar ping pong to just get it right.
But we got there, buddy. So congratulations to you and
awesome.
I. So.
Thank you.